member of the SREG Plant-Rich Diet Task Force. Our team has worked hard to find excellent speakers to provide information supporting our journey. Today is no exception, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to our speaker, Dr. Tushar Mehta. Dr. Tushar Mehta studied at McMaster University and then completed medical school and residency at the University of Toronto. Currently, he practices emergency medicine and has also spent many years practicing family medicine and addictions medicine. Dr. Mehta also participates in international health projects, having volunteered on a yearly basis in rural India and now doing work in Haiti. Along with a small team, Dr. Mehta co-founded Plant-Based Data, www.plantbaseddata.org, an online database which collects and organizes the most important academic and institutional literature regarding the impact of plant-based diet on health, environmental, and food security, including the role of animal agriculture in creating pandemics. With that, Dr. Mehta.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen right now. And so here we go to my presentation. Okay. And sorry about this. Slideshow. Oops. There we go. Sorry, this is acting up here. What is this thing? Can you see my screen, everyone?
Yes.
Yes.
And there's some little thing here saying that, okay, I can just put this over here. Okay. All right. So my presentation is called Animal Agriculture and the Global Environmental Impact. All right. Thank you for the introduction. I don't need to go through this slide because you've so eloquently talked about who I am. And the goal of this presentation is to take a big picture review of the, sorry, I'm gonna just try to minimize something here so I can, where'd my cursor go? There we go. Okay, there we are. Okay, big picture review of the data regarding oops. Oh my goodness, this is, okay. Big picture review of the data about animal versus plant foods with respect to the environment, but also talk about animal agriculture as help people understand the full impact of animal agriculture relative to other environmental problems. All right. Why can't I change my, there we go. Okay, so let's start with, okay, what is going on? Okay, here we go. So I like to talk about people first. Now, everywhere you go, you find beautiful, amazing people on this earth. And these are some of my friends in Haiti that I've worked with. Okay. And when we're talking about people, let's start talking about world population. Now, does 1% growth sound like a lot to us? Because the world grows at about this rate, world population. And that means also that if you start with 7 billion people, you add 1 billion people to Earth every 10 to 12 years. Now we're close to 8 billion people, and it's getting, every 10 years, we're going to add 1 billion people to the Earth. By 2050, we're going to have about 10 billion people on the planet. And by the end of the century, there's a spectrum of possibilities. It can go as high as 15 billion or more, or less than 12 billion people. And that's just at a growth rate that just varies slightly more, slightly less than 1%. A small change in the growth rate has big differences in terms of the number of people that you'll see towards the end of the century. Okay, and on our planet we have pre-COVID about 800 million people, below the sort of global poverty line of less than $1.90 US per day purchasing power parity, equivalent. Over 100 million people suffering severe food shortages, 74 million people affected by conflict, 40 million slaves, according to modern definitions of slavery, and more than 4.2 billion people living on less than $7.50 per day per person in their household. And things have gotten much worse during COVID. And at the same time, the global rich are skyrocketing, not just the billionaires, but all the people who are sort of in the rich category of the world. And a lot of people don't know that if you're making more than about $32,000 US, you're part of the global 1% just by making that amount, which is very common for people in developed countries to make that much on a yearly basis. And if you look at the biomass of humans over the past 10,000 years versus currently, 10,000 years ago, there were, amongst the, tens of thousands of wild vertebrate species on land. We're just going to look at the land animals for now. Humans were probably less than 1% of the biomass. According to a scientist called Vaclav Smil, currently in today's world, wild animals make up about 1% of the biomass, and humans, plus our livestock never really existed more than 10,000 years ago, but humans created livestock since that time, make up about, a third and 2/3 of the vertebrate biomass on land. Now, he's not the only person studying this topic, but suffice to say that other studies show that it may be about, wild animals make about 4% of the biomass, but it's still within that same scale when we're talking about these animals versus humans and the biomass there. That humans can outweigh all wild animals, tens of thousands of species, is incredible, and it's something that that most people don't know, and it should be actually shocking to us. Chickens alone, just chickens on the earth, the combined weight of one species created by humans, because there's no such thing as a natural chicken. This is an animal that's been bred into existence, outweigh all other species of wild birds. And depending on how you define a species, 15 to 20K species of wild birds by 3 times. So we got to appreciate the scale of biomass on Earth. And if you're looking over since from 1970 to sort of closer to today's time, 2017, wild animal populations have decreased by 68%, while humans have almost doubled. So you can see the story of our change in biomass. Humans have altered about 75% of the land-based environment on Earth, 2/3 of the marine environment, 3/4 of all freshwater systems are devoted to crop or livestock use, and we've had a 300% increased crop production since 1970. The world's plant biomass has been cut in half by humans. So that's mainly deforestation. We've cut roughly half of the forests on Earth. And unfortunately, we have not slowed down. In fact, deforestation has been speeding up. Humans control 1/4 of all green life that grows on Earth currently. And agriculture occupies about 40, but maybe closer to 50% of all the non-frozen surface of the Earth. All right. And what we can see here is an ecological genocide of the natural world. I think that's the most fitting way to describe it. And this is very clearly, I'd like to emphasize to people that this is not just a problem of climate change. What we should be looking is not just at, greenhouse gas emissions. That's one parameter we should look at, but we have to look at ecosystems and biodiversity on Earth and the impact that we have on biodiversity. Because too many times people just look at climate and not actually climate in the context of biodiversity. And biodiversity is the real thing that we need to know. So let's start talking about now animal agriculture and the concept of a feed conversion ratio. Okay, this is a very important concept that most people aren't really aware of, and that is how much of if you give plant food to an animal to grow that animal, how much edible plant food is given, and how much edible animal protein comes out of it. Animal protein or animal calories or animal mass. We can look at mass, we can look at protein, we can look at calories. Now let's look at the most favorable parameter towards animal agriculture, keeping the animal agriculture in the best light, let's say. Okay, let's take the best case scenario for animal agriculture. And that is in the form of chicken protein. If you feed 1 kilogram of protein, 3 kilograms of proteins to chickens, at the very most efficient, you can get about 1 kilogram of edible protein back out of chickens. Okay, so it's a 3-to-1 ratio. Now, it doesn't always work that way. Not every farm is always operating all the time at peak efficiency, but it's 3 to 6 kilograms of feed protein given to chickens and 1 kilogram returned to humans for consumption. Okay, it gets a little less efficient for pigs, and then much less efficient for cattle or ruminant protein, 10 to 18 kilograms of protein fed to 1 kilogram returned. The story is even worse with calories in terms of the feed conversion ratio. Now, note again, milk protein and egg protein are sort of on par with chicken protein. Same with farmed fish, and people think that insects or crickets, feeding those to humans is really efficient and environmentally friendly. Well, actually, when you do it on scale, the evidence shows that you don't really get better than the chicken protein efficiency already. And note that these efficiency ratios for chickens, these are done with chickens who are bred to become very efficient at the same time as giving antibiotics and doing all these things to enhance their growth. Okay. Now, when you look at organic farming or grazing animals, as opposed to using factory farming is far more efficient. And grazing, having animals roam around or being free-ranged, that means they're going to be burning calories and using up their protein in other ways and becoming less efficient. Everybody knows that if you're feeding your kid or working out or something like that, the amount of protein you eat is not equivalent to the amount of protein or mass that is gained by a growing child or whoever. And that is because protein is utilized also for energy, for creating enzymes, and for all kinds of bodily functions. It's not just incorporated like you eat a gram of protein and gain 1 gram of protein into your flesh. It doesn't work that way. Your protein is utilized for many functions of the body, aside from just incorporating. Okay, now these animals, chickens and other animals, are bred. Breeding is a form of genetic engineering that we've been engaging in for centuries, and we've perfected it over the past decades, let's say. And you could see it, the average chicken that was a broiler chicken in 1957 and then 1978 and then 2005, how fast and how large they grow over that time has sort of increased exponentially. But we've sort of hit a wall. Since 2005, there has been very little increased feed conversion efficiency and growth efficiency in chickens. We've sort of maximized. Even though we're using now direct gene modification, it hasn't made much of a difference. So we sort of reached this sort of natural peak that we can get to. All right. Now, despite all this breeding and all the antibiotics and other things that are done to make and factory farming and confining animals so they don't move around, they don't burn calories, despite all this technology, animal protein is basically less efficient. Therefore, you're going to grow food to feed these animals, and that is going to take more land, take more water, more soil, more pesticides, antibiotics, fertilizers. And we should note that 50% of the world's crops are fed to animals for a smaller return in the amount of edible protein and calories. Now, in terms of terrestrial livestock, land livestock, not including fish, 70 to 80 billion land animals are slaughtered every year. It's closer to 80 billion now. That's mostly chickens, and that adds up to about 2,000 animals per second that are slaughtered. So again, imagine the scale of all the people and our impact. Monogastric animals, that means chickens, pigs, and other birds, these are animals that have one stomach, similar to humans. They eat grain, soy, oil seeds. They're mainly fed by foods that we grow and we feed them. Even when people are free-ranging their chickens, they're eating some bugs and so forth, but we're also feeding them grains and other things. Okay. Now, ruminants are animals such as cattle, goats, buffalo, sheep. Okay. They can be fed the same food as monogastrics, but they can also eat foods like silage and hay and grass and other foods that cannot be eaten by monogastrics. And as part of the rumination process, this different digestive system that they have, they also create a lot of methane, which is mostly burped. It comes out of their oral or gastric tract, and a little bit tooted from behind. Okay, so when we talk about planetary land use, as we mentioned, 75% of the Earth's non-frozen surface is altered by humans, but 40 to 50%, closer to 50% of the Earth's non-frozen surface is used for agriculture. Now, the vast majority of that surface is actually used for animal agriculture. Animal agriculture occupies close to 40% of the non-frozen surface of the Earth. This single industry occupies most of the surface of the Earth, the most of the human used surface of the Earth. The single industry is the biggest user, okay? 10 to 15% of the Earth's non-frozen surface is used for growing crops, but remember, 50% of those crops are dedicated to feeding animals, and it's about between 5 and 10% of the Earth that grows crops for direct human consumption. Not all of those crops are for protein, like we may be growing broccoli and lettuce and carrots and all kinds of stuff that is not really protein foods, but the protein foods that we grow are occupy a much smaller percentage. Now, remember also that we're growing in that 10 to 15% of the Earth's surface for crops. We're also growing things like cotton and soy and biofuels and things that are not meant for human consumption as well, because soy can also be used for industrial processes and biofuels and things like that as well. Okay, so it's a very small percentage of the Earth's surface that actually grows plant foods for human consumption, and a very small percentage that grows plant protein foods for human consumption, which are basically grains and nuts, seeds, and legumes. Okay, nevertheless, plant protein provides about 60, just above 60% of total human protein needs. Whereas animal foods, despite using all of that surface of the Earth, provides just under 40% of the total protein consumed by humans on the Earth. Okay. Now the numbers vary a little bit by depending on the sources, but it's right about there. Okay. And therefore, animal agriculture is the greatest cause of deforestation, wetland loss, and these environmental problems that are going on the Earth, the greatest soil user as well. Now, grazing and soy production for animals, sorry, I just want to say that, yeah, so as I mentioned there, okay, now, so land use equals ecosystem destruction, okay? As I mentioned, for deforestation, rainforest loss, wetland loss, loss of grasslands, because even if we're grazing animals on a grassland, in most cases, those grasslands were previously different. They may have been forests that have been cut down to create grasslands, or natural grasslands that are very different once animals are grazed there, because the proportion and the type of plants and type of animal species that are there are changed once the grazing process is underway. So there's a biodiversity loss, and it's a far greater impact than eating plants directly. Factory farming is far more efficient than grazing. So therefore, it actually has a much lesser biodiversity impact as compared to grazing animals. But there's other problems. There's more problems with animal welfare, antibiotic resistance, zoonotic diseases. So factory farming is not necessarily better overall, but it has a less environmental impact. Grazing uses the most land, greatest biodiversity impact, and also when it comes to methane release from ruminants, factory farmed cattle or factory farmed sheep or goats produce less methane compared to grazed animals. Grazed animals take longer to grow. They consume more food overall. And when they're ruminating on silage or hay or grass, that rumination process with those feed components creates more methane compared to feeding them grains and oil seeds such as soy, etc. Grazing destroys the natural ecosystem. It has impact on natural vegetation, soil compaction, erosion, and especially when you're grazing animals on marginal land, once you get over a certain threshold, very quickly there's fast erosion and desertification of those lands. It has a great impact on native bird, animal, reptiles, mammal species, and there's variations depending on where you are, depending on where the grazing and the type of animals that you're grazing. There could be some variations in different parts of the world. And there's also the animal waste issue that causes water contamination in many cases, even when there's grazing. And one of the biggest problems with grazing is that there's always elimination of predator species. Humans will kill all predator species in ecosystems where they graze animals. So this whole story of grazing being so natural is not true. Okay, but you have these movies now, and books, and these these speakers like Alan Savory and Woody Harrelson and Sacred Cow and all these people spending millions, the industry spending millions on advertising this sort of false greenwashing picture about grazing. All right, and here's here's an article written by myself and Nicholas Carter talking about how examining and analyzing a study that was essentially funded by the animal agriculture industry, and which they say shows that grazing is ecological, but we're sort of showing that there's a lot of problems with the study if you just go through and look at the data and how they've collected it and what they're doing with it. And as we know as physicians, when you have, for example, drug companies doing research on their own drugs and showing the benefits, that has to have external validation. And in most cases, the drug funded research just basically shows that their own drugs are beneficial, where it may be a very different story if you have non-industry funded research that is done. And the same thing is true for animal agriculture and their research, or the oil industry when they do research showing that oil is actually good or whatever. So water use, animals use more water than plants do on a per protein and calorie unit. And that is because, not just because animals are drinking the water, but because of the irrigation that is required for the plant feed, and also the rainwater. When rain falls on the world, okay, it is meant to go to the ecosystem. But when that ecosystem is being consumed by grazed animals, you are losing the biodiversity, you're affecting the biodiversity, but there's also a loss of the water in terms of its biological role, okay? Remember again, 70% of the world's water is used for agriculture, but 50% of all crops are actually fed to animals. And when it comes to soy, 70 to 80% of all soy is fed to animals. When it comes to soy for direct human consumption, it's hard to calculate that, but there's one resource that shows it's about 6% for direct human consumption. And that, and much of that is just in the form of oil, but in terms of just edible, whole food soy products, it's probably a very small percentage actually. Okay. The other impacts of animal agriculture on water include the eutrophication. So all the fecal matter and fertilizer that is used for fecal matter coming from animals, fertilizer used for animal feed, runs into water systems and causes eutrophication, which is hypergrowth of algae and plant matter, the uses of oxygen, and has many toxic effects in freshwater systems. And as that water goes to the ocean, creates dead zones in the ocean and eutrophication there, water pollution in both freshwater and marine systems. Bacteria and parasites from fecal matter go into water, causing all sorts of problems, soil erosion into water. And there are massive reservoirs from factory farms, just lakes of poop, essentially fecal lakes that run into water, contaminate the land, contaminate groundwater, carry disease, and the consequences are quite severe, as mentioned. In terms of climate change, we always talk about climate change, and there's all this debate about how much greenhouse gas emissions come from animal agriculture and cause global warming. Now, the gases are CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. Those are the three main gases that come from animal agriculture. And the combined effect, as per the United Nations document 2006, shows that it's about 18%, which exceeds all transportation greenhouse gas emissions combined on the planet, as well as exceeding all heating and cooling emissions combined on the planet. That number was downplayed to 14.5% in 2014. There was some political pressure involved and a lot of industry lobbying that involved in recalculating this number, but it still exceeds global transportation, global heating and cooling. Other people who are more in favor of plant diet, calculated the number at 51% or even more, but the truth is likely somewhere in between. And there are, it's probably actually, somewhere between 25, 30%, according to some of the more recent reports. Greenhouse gas emissions per 100 grams of protein. This is a great chart from Our World in Data. And you can see that the ruminants at the top there, beef, lamb, especially from grazing, they cause much greater emissions per unit of protein. And then there's dairy products and other animals. And finally, at the bottom, you have the plant foods, which cause the smallest amount of greenhouse gas emissions per unit protein. Each of these type of products have a spectrum. If you're doing it in the most optimal way versus the least optimal way, there's a spectrum of emissions. And you can see that spectrum in this chart over here. And some of the plant foods, if you're doing them most optimally, they can actually sequester or reduce some of the protein of the greenhouse gases into the ground. They can sequester carbon and have like a negative climate impact, at least for a number of years. For example, if you're growing nut trees, you plant a lot of nut trees, they're going to absorb a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere until they're fully grown. And once they're fully grown and matured and the soil becomes in stability with the trees, you're going to sort of plateau there, okay? But it just shows again that animal-based foods are less efficient than plant-based foods. Here's a great chart regarding the land use from animal agriculture, just some of the same stats that I was talking about. You know, you have the Earth's surface, and then you have the habitable land, and 50% of the habitable land, according to our world in data, and this chart is also reproduced by the United Nations, is for agriculture, and the vast majority of that agricultural land is used for livestock, meat and dairy, and eggs, and supplies only 37% of human consumed protein, 18% of human consumed calories. Okay. Now, when it comes to fishing and fish, back in 1950, about 20 million tons of fish were harvested from the oceans. In 2003, 20 million tons of fish were harvested. In 2016, it's about 140 million tons that are harvested from the ocean in terms of wild fish, and then 60 million tons from aquaculture, which is what we call fish farms, right? And back in 2003, there's a United Nations report calculating the amount of illegal, unregulated, undocumented fish extracted from the ocean, what they call IUU fishing, and that is maybe 11 to 26 million tons estimated, which may be increased by now. So these numbers are somewhat changed now from 2016 to 2021, but you can see the vast amount of extraction that happens from the ocean and from aquaculture, and aquaculture is very much growing. There's this organization in the UK, Fish Count, .uk.org, calculates about 1 to 2 trillion fish are extracted from the ocean per year in terms of number of fish. And that's about 30,000 to 60,000 fish per second that are taken from the ocean. This, again, gives us an appreciation of the scale of what humans are able to do to the earth. And because of this, there's a vast ocean ecosystem destruction at play. 33% of marine fish populations are harvested at levels, as per the UN, that are unsustainable. We are just diminishing the fish populations year by year. 60% of fish populations are harvested at maximum levels, meaning that you're just on the edge. You're probably decreasing those populations, although they're not sort of rapidly dropping. And only 7% are within so-called sustainable levels, where the fish populations are just in balance with the amount of fishing that's going on, and they seem like healthy populations. Farmed fish is not an eco-friendly product. This is blue washing. I hope everybody has seen the movie called Seaspiracy. It's not a perfect movie, but by and large, what they say is very true. And if you look on plant-based data, my website, there is a great document there that goes through the academic sources about the impact of fishing industry on the environment, as well as on human beings that are in the fishing industry. There's a lot of slavery and abuse of humans in the fishing industry. Fishing industries dominate eco-certification organizations, basically, and they basically label themselves as eco-friendly without really any science behind it at all. And in terms of fish, a lot of people give less credence to fish in terms of ethical issues, fish sentience, cognition, and the fact that fish are living beings. The more different a living organism is compared to us, the less it seems that we are able to consider it in terms of a living being and attributes of a living being. Okay, pain, emotional states, social interactions, and so forth. Okay, now bycatch, as I mentioned, there's this IUU fishing that is happening, but also there's shark finning that happens, and most of the bycatch. So the birds, marine mammals, turtles, sharks, whales that are caught in nets of the fishing industry is enormous, and that's what we call bycatch or bykill, or also fish that are non-targeted species. So people may be fishing for certain species, but other species are concurrently caught in these nets, and that's also bycatch. So it's there's a massive amount of life lost, biodiversity lost, that is just wasted in the from the fishing industry. And there's this military competition over the oceans, and every bit of the ocean is mapped out and tracked by different computer systems, satellite systems, GPS, etc. Fish populations are tracked, and people are extracting fish so fast, and the bycatch level concurrently is enormous. Now, ALDFG, what we call abandoned, lost, discarded fishing gear, that's an actual term, ALDFG, and the fishing industry has an enormous amount of plastic waste that goes into the oceans. These nets can be many kilometers long, and all the plastic from fishing lines and this enormous industry, these things eventually break down. And the easiest thing to do, rather than pulling them up back onto a ship and then transporting them onto land and then finding out where to dispose of them and transport them, mostly they're just cut and released into the ocean and become part of the plastic waste in the ocean. But they are the most deadly plastic waste, because these nets float around for decades and they continue to trap all kinds of marine wildlife, fish and marine mammals and birds, etc., for just years and years. And they're the deadliest of the plastics, entangling all kinds of life in the oceans. 46% of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is actually fishing gear. And then industry and media create these fake solutions, such as banning straws, which doesn't make any sense. Why would you ban the straw and not the plastic cup? Create these fake solutions and make people think that, hey, we're doing something when we're really not doing anything. So they're experts at greenwashing and creating fake solutions. Now, when it comes to biodiversity loss and extinction of animals and plant species in general, now we're not just talking about fish anymore, but talking about all animals, animal agriculture is considered one of the top, or perhaps the top, insult. We are in what we call the Anthropocene extinction era. There are an estimated 11 million species on the Earth. That includes everything from bacteria to plants and animals and insects, everything. So about 1 million are thought currently to be threatened, okay? And we're not just talking about the extinction of species, but we're talking about the extinction and annihilation of ecosystems. Animal agriculture is the biggest cause because of the vast impact as we've outlined. But remember, there are multiple concurrent causes: the massive human population, other forms of land use change and ecosystem fragmentation, such as building roads and having cars everywhere, the material economy, everything we extract to produce material things, and the impact of processing materials, using the materials and discarding them, different pollutants, climate change, as I mentioned, is not the factor we should be looking at, but one of the many important factors that we should be looking at: urban design, transportation, etc. Okay, we should look at all these things concurrently. Now, hunting. People think hunting is sustainable. There are 362 megafauna species on the Earth. That means large animals, that are more than a certain number of kilograms. And they are in very fast decline. 70% of them are in severe decline, and 59% of them are at risk of extinction. And hunting is one of the biggest cause, because these are the animals that are targeted by humans to hunt for, whether it's bushmeat or other forms of hunting. Now, we have all these industries, such as logging, for example, that provides roads into all kinds of forested areas. And then we have guns and fossil fuels and all kinds of vehicles, cell phones, GPS, computer systems, etc., that guide the hunting process now, even in village situations. Even simple sort of poor societies are very efficient at hunting animals. And then currently you have habitat loss, which is the other big cause of loss of megafauna, because everything, we've changed most of the surface of the earth. We have roads going everywhere, people going everywhere. There's loss of intact habitat for these animals, and large animals require large areas in which to roam and to carry out their lives in a way that is part of their ecosystem. So we have these combined insults, but hunting is very impactful to megafauna species. So now food security, okay? So the population is increasing, and we need to feed the humans on Earth, right? We need humans to be happy, healthy, well-fed, and food security is a critical issue. Now, considering the low efficiency of animal-based foods, we can see that this will impact food security. In fact, there's a good study showing that even if we just took all the existing farmland and just switched it over to growing food for humans, as opposed to growing food for animals to then be eaten by humans. So instead of taking away the animal mediary and just feeding humans directly, we could create food, for an additional 4 billion people just like that. Now, that doesn't mean we can automatically solve food security problems, because we're not very good at sharing our resources or getting them to people who need them. So, it doesn't mean that we'll solve, problems automatically this way, but it just shows you how much more food you can actually create. All right. Now, when it comes to foods that are and land that is used for animal feed, most of these animals are consumed by the global rich. That is the global rich in the global north or Western countries, and also the global rich that exist within the developing world. Okay, most of the animals that are bred and fed go towards rich people. This takes away the base plant food and diverts protein and calories away from the global poor and towards the global rich. Okay, and so therefore there's a food justice issue when it comes to animal-based foods. Overall, not in every single case. Of course, there are some animal-based foods that are eaten by the global poor, and some global poor depend on these as sources of protein and other nutrients. But most of the animal products are consumed by the global rich overall. Okay, and and if we took grains and plant proteins, fed them directly to people, as I mentioned, we can feed most of the people on Earth very sufficiently, and we'll have a lot of extra land that's left over, which can be converted back into natural ecosystems. More on this. Okay, so meat exports from poor countries mostly benefit the global rich, and feed that is grown in poor countries basically, again, benefit the global rich mostly. Okay, there is a lot of displacement of farmers in developing countries by the meat industry, actually, and a lot of land grabbing that occurs amongst people who live in villages and rural populations, and in a big displacement of indigenous peoples, especially in places like the Amazon, where meat industry is rampantly taking over the land and from whoever lived there prior. Okay, so there's this colonialism that occurs. In fact, in North America and the Americas, there was Aboriginal people in most places, and the process of clearing the land and replacing most of the land with animal agriculture and cattle was part of this colonial expansion. You're getting rid of Aboriginal people from the land and replacing them with this vast cattle farming. That's the thing that took the most land. So that was part of the colonial process. Now we've sort of occupied all this land in North America, but this colonial process is happening now in the Amazon. Biofuels present the same problem. Biofuels are not ecological, but the problem is not as big as animal agriculture as of yet. Now, Canada's food guide, our newest food guide, actually has become more plant-based. Our more recent food guide is more plant-based, showing that we can reduce animal proteins in our consumption and will be more healthy with a plant-based diet, a whole food plant-based diet that incorporates the different food groups of a plant-based diet. So it's been progress in terms of our current food guide, but the government hasn't really promoted this food guide very much, actually. But the Lancet medical journal has the Eat Lancet project, and they've created the most progressive food guide compared to any single country. And they have scientists and researchers from all kinds of different countries, many different countries, coming together and creating a food guide that can be suited to most cultures in the world, really, and showing that animal source protein could be very minimized and is actually optional. And this type of diet can have a lower environmental impact, be better for food security, and also increase human nutrition, reducing mortality, diabetes, and certain types of cancers, heart disease, etc. So the Eat Lancet is a excellent project and presents a really great sort of plant-centric, plant-rich or plant-based, whichever terminology you want to use, food guide. And so, they're talking about how to feed 10 billion people in 2050, minimize the ecological damage, increase human health, and decrease these diseases at the same time. So it's a great project. When we talk about plant-based diets, we're not talking about exclusively plant-based diets. We're talking about mostly plant-based diets, where the majority of protein, calories, and other nutrients come from plant-based foods. And Eat Lancet is a great source of this information, incorporating a lot of relevant research. So sort of getting to the point of wrapping up the environmental picture here, we can show that plant-based diets are fundamental to reversing the global ecological crisis, okay? Remembering still that this is a complex issue, okay? If you go to plant-based data, you will see much more information that I've provided in this one lecture, and you'll see many of the nuances that occur there. And we got to remember, concurrently, we want to reduce food waste, which is 30 to 40% of all foods. We want to eliminate in most of biofuels, okay, which again take land away from food production. And we want to use pulses and whole grains as the main replacement for animal protein. With all the land that we save, we will take this huge amount of land and be able to grow our food on a much, 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 much smaller footprint of land if we go plant-based. And then this excess land can be rewilded. We can allow nature to grow back on the land that we save. And that's going to be incredible for biodiversity preservation and also reduce greenhouse gas emissions and sequester carbon. As forests and wildlife grows, that will take carbon back into the biomass and into the soil, okay? Love your pulses. Remember, pulses are the best protein source. Soy is one of the pulses, but not the only pulse. Most pulses are about 20% protein in terms of their dry weight, and they have minuscule greenhouse gas impacts. They fix nitrogen from the atmosphere into the soil and help other crops grow better. They thus reduces fertilizer requirements. And indigenous peoples in most of the Americas, South America and North America, not so much the farther north, but the more heavily populated areas, grew the three sisters: beans, corn, and squash. And for protein and complete nutrition and an ecological way of farming, that each plant supported the other plant, actually, and reduced, of course, they didn't require so much chemical fertilizers for that. Soy is fantastic for human health. It becomes bad for the environment when you're feeding it to animals or using it for biofuels. But if you're growing it for direct human consumption, and it is a very efficient source of protein and extremely nutritious. And whole grains, about 10% protein by mass. Some of them are higher. And as we breed them and have different cultivars, some of them are high in much higher in protein than others. So pulses are excellent as a whole grain, not as refined grains. Great. So remember, some plant foods have a high eco impact. So many of our oils, they provide minimal nutrition, but take a lot of resources to create. So we should reduce oils in our diet, and especially reduce things like palm oil, ramen. Avocados are not necessarily good for the environment, okay, depending on where they're coming from. The avocados from Mexico have a disproportionate impact. You know, foods transported on airplanes are going to have high emissions. Packaging of our foods, sugars are mostly unnecessary to consume, therefore have an ecological impact without a human benefit, with minimal human benefit, and in most cases a human harm. So we got to remember that stuff. Remember human rights. So, you know, chocolate, bananas, workers' rights issues in the plant-based industry also have to be considered. Switching gears a little bit, I just want to mention pandemics. COVID-19 is most likely caused by a type of animal agriculture where we bring all these animals together in a wet market. They transmit viruses to each other. The animals become sick. You have all kinds of new variants of the of a coronavirus that are generated from the wet market, and eventually you unluckily get one that affects humans and becomes a pandemic across the globe. That's what probably happened with COVID-19. There's a lab theory, but it's very, very, very less likely. Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, SARS, 2002 coronavirus, these are also caused by animal agriculture. So is the H1N1 swine flu from 2009, HIV, Ebola, the Spanish flu, measles, and smallpox. These viruses that have killed millions of people and caused suffering for so many come from animal agriculture. Again, you have these viruses that now within nature, they are stable within their own species, their nature. But when humans bring animals together in large numbers, and you start having this biogenerator of viruses in nature, species have certain patterns of behavior. They stay within certain boundaries. They've co-evolved with certain viruses, and these viruses may even have an ecological role, and there's a stability there. These viruses are not making the animals sick and not really making the humans sick either, because humans are distant from these wild animals, generally speaking. But when you bring animals together in the millions, then you have variants of the virus that actually make the animal population sick. Whereas in nature, if influenza virus was inside, the influenza virus comes from ducks and waterfowl and stays in the GI tract, infects one species to the next, and is generally harmless. If there is a bad mutation that harms the animal, they may kill those animals, but then fail to spread to other ducks. And therefore the virus will sort of self-destruct if it kills its own host, right? But if you bring millions of animals together, then bad mutations can generate and in fact be more efficient at spreading to other animals within the confined area compared to the natural viruses. And viruses that make the animals sick can infect the respiratory tracts and do all kinds of different things. These new mutations spread between different species, continue to mutate, and kill many of the farmed animals. Every year we hear about millions of animals that are culled because of viruses spreading amongst those animals. But some of those mutations can come back and spill over into humans and cause human disease and cause human pandemics. This is a graphic that comes from a 2012 paper showing exactly what pretty much happened with COVID-19, and it's predicting, it's showing the process by which we know that animal agriculture will continue to cause human harm through creating new mutations that become pandemics. Okay, all right. Now, the role of animal agriculture, you have these thousands, and in fact millions and billions of animals. A single farm may contain sort of over 1 million animals and creates these ideal breeding grounds. And I've reviewed, I think, most of the information in this slide, so I'm not going to go over it in too much more detail. There's two types of animal agriculture of mass animal agriculture. One is factory farming. So things like the Spanish flu came from factory farming in North America. This is in 2018, where factory farms were still much smaller. But this generates that was more a family farm actually in 2018 when we're talking about the Spanish flu, but factory farms now are big biogenerator of viruses. And then wet markets and bushmeat and hunting, these type of processes still involve millions of animals. And both of these types of mass animal agriculture accelerate the process of viral mutations. Small scale and historical animal agriculture still present a risk, but it's a slower process. I should put the Spanish flu in this category, as well as diseases like measles and smallpox. Over the centuries, we've generated these zoonotic diseases that have affected humans. But the modern mass animal agriculture will accelerate this process. All right. Again, more papers just showing the process of how coronaviruses spread amongst animals and cause these human diseases. Okay, and again, more papers showing the same thing, talking about, in this case, COVID-19 and the processes that occurred. I have a podcast on this issue. You're welcome to take a look at it, as well as a whole section on plant-based data, and the reference list for this podcast is there as well, so you can take a look at the references and see many papers about this. Just concluding, I think it's time for us to wrap up. Hopefully I haven't gone too much over time. Plant-based diet is fundamental to sustainability, and it's on par in terms of its ecological impact as the materials economy or the entire fossil fuel economy on a global scale, okay? Now, remember, this does not mean that just by becoming plant-based or becoming vegan that, oh yeah, I can drive whatever car I want or fly around or have a large house. It doesn't offset your individual impact in other ways like that. So it doesn't give us a free pass to do other things. All of these things have to be taken together in consideration in terms of our environmental impact. And we have to look at animal agriculture in conjunction with social justice, population, environmental economics, governments, war, peace, industry, and all other forms of overconsumption, climate change, etc. Okay, and a shout out to Greta Thunberg, who is one of the people who really loves to put all this information together and see things in context of each other. Okay, things that people don't want to think about but must be thought about, and she's really good at doing that, and is in line with all of this science. I think that's it. I have a couple other slides here that I was giving as part of a university lecture. I'm not going to get into them now. I think what I should do is just maybe remind everybody about my website, Plant-Based Data, right there, and hopefully we have a little bit of time for questions, because I've taken a long time just speaking. I'm going to stop my screen sharing here and let you guys take over again.
Well, that is fantastic. If anybody does have any burning questions, I know we just have a few minutes, unless Dr. Mehta is willing to stay a little extra longer.
I can stay a bit extra, sure.
Fantastic, thank you. So I just want to say thank you so much for this incredibly powerful presentation and spending some time with us today. Really, just the things that I think about are mostly takeaways, and it all ties together so well in some of the other presentations that we've had from Anna Bradley, in terms of how some of us end up in kind of an echo chamber and think that things are necessarily getting better, but really maybe we have a long way to go still. And from Dr. Rao, which I believe I saw you have some of his work on, the data website that you have. One of the things I'm curious about is just in terms of, it seems like you've identified as, the grazing area as being, a problematic area, so to speak. And one of the things I just kind of grapple with or try to foresee is, how one day will we be able to, influence that land use to be used for more carbon sequestration. Whether that's, do you see the path forward on that just being more on the demand side from the consumer, or working together more with the farmers? Do you have any comments around that?
Well, I mean, grazing has a disproportionately high environmental impact. Okay, it has a higher impact. Even what they call regenerative grazing has a higher impact than factory farming in most cases. So the most important factor here is, as we decrease consumption of these products, as there's less demand, there's a lighter environmental footprint. Now, in some ways, regenerative grazing, so-called regenerative grazing, can be beneficial. It depends on what it's replacing. If you have like really, really, really intensive grazing practices that are very destructive, and now they lower the amount of animals, and institute some of these regenerative, sort of these improved practices, you're going to be better than a worse form of grazing. But you're not going to be better, and you may be better than the worst forms of plant-based agriculture, but you're not going to be better than normal plant-based agriculture or the optimized plant-based agriculture. You're not going to be better than that, you know. And the most important thing is, I think, is just reducing consumption.
Great, thank you. If anybody else has any questions, they want to raise their hand. I see Andrea has her hand up, so I'll ask her to unmute.
Oh, great. Thanks, Mike. Thank you, Dr. Mehta. That was just a fantastic, fantastic presentation. One of my favorite studies is the carbon opportunity cost of animal agriculture by Hayek and Ripple and others. You may be familiar with that one too, that showed that if the world were to reduce consumption of meat by 70%, we could sequester, what was it, 362 gigatons of carbon dioxide by 2050. I think that was the number. That is so important, and I cite that study a lot. But I've had people say that they don't really believe that study because climate change is going to make it very difficult for native forests to regrow. And I wonder if you've ever heard this criticism of the argument that if we reduce animal agriculture, we can liberate land back to nature for regrowth of native vegetation.
Yeah, I mean, rewilding is a complex subject. When you allow land to rewild, it may not become exactly as it was prior to human occupation. Okay, and there's papers about this, and there are things you can do to help it become more towards its original state, which is, you know, thought to be the best thing because you're trying to encourage the biodiversity that was there, right? If you can, you know, and encourage biodiversity. So from a biodiversity standpoint, this is probably the best case scenario. But anything that grows there, when forests grow back, nothing sequesters more carbon than trees. And it's not just the trees, it's then the layer of forest detritus that's on the ground, and then all of the carbon, you know, all the different plant matter that incorporates in different layers of the soil. That is never greater than a natural ecosystem, even if it's a natural grassland or any other natural thing. So rewilding is always going to be the best. Climate change may inhibit some forest regrowth because it encourages forest fires, right? So you may have more forest fires, and people may say, well, you're not going to have as many forests because you're going to have more forest fires due to climate change. You know, forest fires are a complex issue. It's not just because of climate change. Increased climate change is causing forest fires, but then there's other human factors that increase forest fires too, because we suppress fires all the time, and therefore eventually have bigger fires when they do occur and so forth. But generally speaking, you know, you're always going to sequester the most carbon when you grow back natural habitats, even if there's fires, right? And that's and the Hayek paper that you mentioned, they're taking a conservative approach, right? They're sort of looking at, they're taking conservatively, if we rewild and regrow forests, how much can we sequester, right? So it's a good paper. It's an important paper. One of the things I always like to tell the audience is, listen. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Somebody. One of the things I like to tell people is that, listen, you'll see people who say this, you'll see people who say that, and give different points of view. The information that I presented, somebody else will present the opposite information, and they'll put that into a slick presentation as well. The thing that's important here is not just what I say, but the fact that you can look at the references that I'm quoting, right? And I'm not just quoting a few references. Like, look at the summary list that we have on plant-based data. If you're using plant-based data, you can see the video that I've just, a lecture that's similar to this. You can then look at the summary regarding key articles that we have on the environment section. So just go through that extensive list of summaries and go through that and see how many good articles there are that talk about the issues that we've discussed. And then you go into the library, where you'll find literally a few thousand studies. And again, it's not just one or two studies that kind of give the perspective that I'm talking about. It's you have to look at the balance of the literature, and you have to look at many, many studies. Go to the plant-based data summaries, and then just search the word climate and see how many studies pop up, or then go to the library and go to the climate folder and see how many studies that we have there, right? And look at the body of literature. So that's what we should be doing to help form our opinions. And that's where I think that what I'm saying is a better representation of what's really going on compared to some industry funded type people, and their, handful of studies that in many cases they misinterpret. Sometimes they have studies that go against what they're saying, but they still use them as a reference, just to put them down as a reference. But the study actually doesn't support what they're saying. They've just misused a reference. I should take into the question.
So Joyce has a question.
First off, great presentation. Thank you so much. It makes me feel good about my recent conversion to vegetarian. I was curious what was wrong with avocados, because I love avocados.
Right. So when you talk about billions of people, right? When billions of people do something, there's going to be an impact. So that doesn't mean that, being plant-based or being vegan is automatically sustainable. In avocados in North America mostly come from a certain region of Mexico. It's a very special forest that exists in a very small geographic area that has the best soil and climate and so forth for growing avocado trees. This is a very high biodiverse area, and people are cutting down that forest rampantly to grow avocados.
Okay,
and so the native trees, the native ecosystem is being annihilated to grow avocados, because you have literally hundreds of millions of people consuming avocados. Even in Asia, they're importing avocados from this area throughout Canada, US, everywhere, mostly getting our avocados from this one small area. The monarch butterfly, which many of you are familiar with, as part of their life cycle, they all go to this they migrate all over North America, but then they all in their life cycle come back to this one forest. And a part of their life cycle occurs there. And as we eliminate this ecosystem, we are impacting the monarch butterfly. It's just one of the species that are impacted. And 99% of monarch butterflies are gone. There's only 1% of them left. You probably remember how many there were in your childhood, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's not just because of avocados. There's many other insults that are affecting monarch butterflies, but this is one of the main ones, okay? But there's also all our roads and pollution, our occupation of land everywhere, right? That is hazardous now to, unhospitable to many species, including the monarch butterfly. But just provides an example that when millions of people go to eat one food, you can have problems. So our plant-based diet should also look at social justice issues for humans, look at sustainabilities of the individual foods, look at our packaging, look at our transportation, and all these different components of the food. So not every plant-based food is sustainable. Palm oil is not sustainable, but if you replace it with other forms of oil, those other forms of oil are also not sustainable. We just need to decrease our oil consumption because we are billions of people consuming these things. Okay, so it's important to look at the ecological and human impacts. There's slavery that occurs throughout the meat industry, especially in the fishing industry, but also that occurs in the plant-based industry. I encourage people to go and look at a website called the Food Empowerment Project. Just Google Food Empowerment Project. Great website. They'll talk about some of the plant foods, especially chocolate. Most chocolate is through slave labor. It's like blood diamonds. They're just most of the chocolate that we eat. So I very much try to stick to organic, certified organic or fair trade chocolate to hopefully avoid these problems. I'm not perfect, but probably I've eliminated 95% of the slave labor in the chocolate I consume. So these things are really important in plant-based foods as well. I think Andrea has a question here.
Oh, thank you. But I want to open it up to anybody else because I've already asked one before I asked mine. If there's another one.
I had a question. Yeah. Dr. Mehta, going back to rewilding, assuming somehow, we can address the demand side of the problem by reducing people's need to eat meat and non-plant-based foods. What needs to be done on the other side, the supply side, to actually get rewilding done? Who's doing work on it? Is someone actually researching this, proposing ideas? What's happening in that area?
Yeah, there is research going on in this area. If you go to plant-based data, the environment library, and go to land use change rewilding folder, and then you can look into the rewilding subfolder there. That's of course not comprehensive, but I'm trying to always populate that folder. On the one side, we have to look at how ecosystems are degraded, and right now, overall on Earth, there's a rapid degradation of ecosystems. So there's not a lot of rewilding that's actually going on. Okay. And even a lot of the reforestation projects that some of these billionaires like to talk about, oh, we're going to plant these trillion trees and all that stuff. They're not doing it in a way that's very eco-friendly. They haven't thought it out properly. They think they're smarter than they really are in many cases. And a lot of these, reforestation projects are not the same as rewilding projects. Okay, rewilding really has to take many factors into consideration in terms of what the native flora and fauna and trees and wildlife is. So just reforestation is not the same as rewilding. So rewilding is more nuanced, but ultimately will be best for biodiversity on Earth. And hopefully we can do it. Hopefully we can do it in a way that's friendly to the local human populations as well. So it's not just about rewilding without thinking of the local human populations. We have to do it kind of in concert with local populations and try to meet their needs at the same time. So it's a complex process, but it's very, very important. So there's research done in this and a lot of criticism of current reforestation projects, which do some good, but can also cause some harms at the same time. Everything is complex and also fail to meet some of their targets. So it's a complex, this is not my area of expertise, but all I'm going to say is that this is a very, very critically important and complex subject. But first and foremost, it requires us to release our hold on the land and release the human control of the land, release the human use of the land, and then scientifically, ecologically, sociologically, in terms of thinking about the population, human populations that live in those places, try to do a sustainable rewilding. And this is going to be very, very critical for biodiversity on Earth. And right now, as I said, biodiversity is in crisis, and rewilding is not happening on a large scale, but needs to happen on a large scale.
Thank you.
I think Ambery is up.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Mehta, for this wonderful presentation. I'm Ambery. I'm a part of the Plant-Rich Diet Task Force, and I'm in Singapore. I'm actually in the process of creating a presentation about how energy consumption, or rather, let's say energy conservation, can be much more efficient on an individual level if we choose to eat more plants. So it's like when we talk about plant-rich diet or plant-based diet, we are most of the times talking about saving greenhouse gases. We're talking about saving water, reducing our land footprint, and all of that. But we seldom talk about the energy that can be saved if we eat certain foods and if we eat some other foods in less quantities. So, but unfortunately, what has happened is that when I was researching, I did not really find a lot of comparison between animal foods and plant foods and the energy conservation, energy consumption, energy that is needed for, let's say, processing both these categories of food, or distribution, or finally consumption. So I was just wondering, does plant-based data I searched your website as well, but I'm just wondering whether, did I miss it? Do you have is anybody doing any research on this front, or is it that is it that there is no difference probably in animal foods, the way animal foods are processed and plant foods are processed in the context of energy consumption?
Okay, that's a good question. So when it comes to plant plant-based foods versus animal foods, the bigger issue is greenhouse gas emissions, right? So there is a folder on climate change in plant-based data, and that's really the bigger issue. Now, energy consumption is an important issue, but it's, there's other things where humans use vastly more, use more energy, right? But it's still an important issue. So you will find papers that do talk about energy consumption in plant versus animal agriculture, but I haven't organized those studies into a single folder. The way I organize the website, the database, is that, for example, you have a paper. That paper may have multiple topics in it. So you may have a paper that talks about biodiversity, talks about land use, talks about climate, greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll take that paper and make sure it's filed in all of the relevant folders, okay? And so I'll do that. Or what I'll do is I'll put a signpost, and sometimes instead of saving the same paper in multiple places, I'll have a folder that says, okay, climate change and then land use. And it'll say, hey, go to the land use folder and look at the climate change folder there. So I'll show where the main folder is and go to there. A little signpost to show where you can go to find the things. I haven't organized, and maybe I should have, an energy use folder, okay, where I just talk about which type of farming uses the most energy. Now, there are papers throughout there. You're just gonna have to go around looking and reading multiple papers. I've literally, gone through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of papers, so I know that they're there, okay? And they're not necessarily a paper exclusively about energy consumption, but they mention the parameter of energy consumption as one of the topics discussed in the paper, amongst other topics. So the fishing industry, there's different kinds of aquaculture and different kinds of fishing industry. They use certain types of energy. Transportation of plant foods uses certain types of energy. Refrigeration of foods uses a certain amount of energy. Traveling on a plane, as I mentioned, uses a certain amount of energy. If you're transporting animal or a plant food on an airplane, that uses a certain amount of energy. There's talking about, there's section there on what we call cellular agriculture, where we're creating plant-based meat, what they call lab-grown meat, and precision fermentation, where they get microorganisms to create, let's say, milk proteins and all that kind of stuff. There's discussion about energy use within the papers there. So the information regarding energy use is incorporated in many sections of the papers there. Okay, but I haven't isolated those into one section. That's what you're not seeing in plant-based data. So if you keep going through, you'll find information on this important topic, but there's going to be a lot of reading and screening that you're going to do. I'll give you a trick, okay? I don't know if I should say this online, but everything is in Google Drive, okay? So the way to search plant-based data easily is you can just download the whole database if you want to, okay? You can download it. You're seeing our back end of our website. You download the whole thing onto your computer, search and look at things much more easily, okay? You can do that as well, all right? So that'll help you quickly.
But will it be dynamic? Like if you add in more, if I download it?
No, you'd have to re-download. You'd have to re-download. You can download it every few months or something like that if you want to.
Okay,
yeah.
Sure. All right.
But that'll help you speed up your search if you're looking for very particular things and if you're combing through the database, then you're going to really want to read a lot of papers. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. But you can download a paper and then search it for the terms that you're looking for.
Yeah.
Search the term energy. Right?
Yeah.
Download a paper that looks relevant to the topic and then search the term energy and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Welcome. Dawn has a question.
So I see Dawn has a question.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful presentation. It's amazing all the work that you've done. Thank you for your dedication to this. I have a question because, so I live in Canada, in Alberta, and we lived in Banff for 5 years. And someone that I was close to, she actually helped bring the bison back to Banff National Park. And some of the information she's given me is that she would actually rather eat bison because it is a regenerative species. It actually increases the biodiversity of the environment that it's in because of all the different, it increases the amount of insects, which increases the birds. It's kind of like one of those keystone species, I assume. And so she says she would actually rather eat bison than eat something like soy based on how it impacts the environment. And I'm curious as to your thoughts around that. and what you know about the bison. And the indigenous people have been, going back before colonialism, were in balance with the bison, and it was kind of their, almost like a god, because they used every bit of it and they were in balance with it for tens of thousands of years as part of their culture and their life. So just curious.
Yeah, there's multiple issues to discuss with what you were just mentioning there. Now, one major environmental principle, most people don't know much about environmental anything, okay? And they say all kinds of environmental things, not knowing what they're talking about at all, okay? One of the most important things that we have to discuss is we have to look at not what an individual does, but we have to look at what humans do as a group, okay? If there was like 1,000 people on Earth and we all drove an SUV, driving an SUV would be fine. Who cares? There's only 1,000 people. You're driving an SUV, so what, right? But unfortunately, there are nearly 8 billion people on the Earth. And we have to think about what happens when not just you or I do something, or 1,000 people do something, or 10,000 people, or 100,000 people do something. We have to think about what happens when 1 million people, or 10 million, or 100 million people do something, okay? That's what we have to think about. So if you wanted to eat bison or moose or something like that, instead of, let's say, cows, we would probably kill every single bison and every single moose in North America within a few days with current meat consumption. If we just replace cattle with bison, you're going to eliminate all of these animals because they exist in such a small number compared to the animals that we're breeding. You switch your chickens and cattle and beef consumption, you essentially, but maybe within a couple of days, you'll kill every single moose on the planet. If everybody decided you'll eat moose meat instead, okay? But if everybody switched to soy, you would still just use like maybe 3-4% of the surface area of the planet, and you could rewild the rest of it. In fact, you can bring bison back all over the place, because right now your cattle are occupying the spaces where bison should be. That's the real issue. And so it's like, I have some people who says, oh, I have this, I'm going to take this land. I bought this plot of land, and I'm going to make my passive house there, develop a passive house that's very low energy consumption. And they think that this is good for the environment. No, it's not. You're taking a forested area, a natural area of land, and now you're intruding into that land, creating more roads and human intrusion into land that is currently a natural or closer to a natural ecosystem. And so your passive house is not ecological. You should stick to where other people live in the cities, try to do something ecological there, but you should not be going into nature. Because if another 100,000, another million people decided to go and do that, you're having more intrusion into nature. Same thing for firewood. Burning firewood, because people have done it for millions of years, is not sustainable. If everybody started to sort of switch to firewood instead of gas, you would deforest the earth very rapidly. Eating bison is just part of this environmental error that she's making. And like us as people who are not indigenous people living in this land, there's this sort of train of argument. Okay, indigenous people did this, they did it, and what they did was good, therefore I can do it, and it will also be good. It's this simple form of reasoning that makes no sense, because we are not indigenous people. We're not living in a society of indigenous people. We are, 10,000 years ago, there might have been 1 or 2 million people on the planet. If you go back 10,000 years or 20,000 years, there might have been 1 or 2 million people on the planet. Now we are, 8,000 million people on the planet. That's 8 billion people. This is not the same thing, right? And everything has changed. And even the stories, that we have, and this is a very tricky and sensitive subject, we oversimplify our stories about indigenous people too. There are indigenous people who live on the earth that have lived the way that they have lived in the environment that they have lived for thousands of years in the same way. Those people are very few, but there are some remaining people like that. There are other indigenous people who now, wear clothing like this. They use plastic, they use electricity, they use gasoline, they drive pickup trucks, they have snowmobiles, they have, rubber boots and Gore-Tex clothes, and use, fossil fuels and all that kind of stuff, and cell phones and GPS and all that kind of stuff. There's a spectrum of everybody. And what people did pre-colonization is very different than what people do right now. And the story is very complicated. I don't want to go, too much into it, but it's a complex thing. And there's all kinds of sensitive issues around that too. But our stories are often oversimplified. But, even companies, corporations, when they advertise regenerative grazing, they create this picture of a few cows on grass as their sort of logo, but you have a mega corporation behind that logo, right? And then they're impacting indigenous peoples and people who are living on, poor people who are, or people who are living in rural population, traditional lifestyles. Those are the people they're impacting. There's this twisted logic that occurs. And I think that what your friend is saying is just part of that twisted, oversimplified logic, really, that's going on. Now, we should be rewilding and we should be bringing bison back, but that doesn't mean we have to eat them. Let them do what they did, and bison also existed for millions of years prior to humans even arriving into North America. Because remember, humans come from Africa originally, and we've now, gone everywhere across the earth. And when early humans came across the earth, we also basically caused mass extinction around the earth. There's a Pleistocene extinction era of early humans going around the earth. Now, these are the ancestors of all of us, because all of us were indigenous people at one point. And most of us became part of different types of societies. Maybe we became more into organized agrarian societies, and a lot of indigenous people were agrarian societies. Remember that too. Not all indigenous people were hunter-gatherers. So we became then part of rural societies and lived in small villages and tribes and all that kind of stuff. And then, over the centuries and millennia, we developed into different kinds of societies that we have today. But our ancestors, whether they went to India or to Europe or to other parts of the world, caused mass extinction. And then we sort of got into the stable relationship with nature. So there's good evidence that after the Pleistocene extinction era, that spanned, a few thousand years, right? People, whether they were in Africa or whether they were in Asia or whether they were in North America, sort of developed a relative stability with the remaining flora and fauna, which was mostly stable. We still maybe have caused some extinctions, but our extinction rate slowed down, became mostly stable. And then as we started again evolving our technologies and expanding our societies, we entered into again, a faster extinction and biodiversity loss process. Okay, so it's this complex thing, and it's a very, very touchy subject when we talk about all these kinds of things about the human, going across the earth and indigenous peoples and who we are and identity and all the injustice that humans cause to each other in this process. It's such a difficult and I think painful thing. We definitely need to support, like anything, existing indigenous peoples wherever they are on the earth. That is really, 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 really important. But that doesn't mean that we as settlers around the earth can simply just do what people did pre-colonization and call it sustainable. In some cases we can, maybe if you grow beans, corn, and squash. But even still, if we take a large area to grow our beans, corn, and squash, compared to having some kind of organic, plant-based agriculture on a smaller parcel of land, that may still be important because of our high population that we have right now. So even for plant-based agriculture, the story is not, just a slam dunk like that. We still have to be careful how we do that too.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. I really appreciate that response. Thank you.
Dr. Mehta, thank you for being so gracious with your time. I'm happy to ask if anybody else has any questions, but I also want to be respectful of your time moving forward. I see Manish raise his hand.
Yeah, I just want to thank Tushar for agreeing. And I almost twisted his arm because he has given me a hard time with different dates of his availability. He's very busy. So I really want to thank him and Andrea for working out the timing of this talk. And it's perfect and appropriate. And I want to compliment you for all the rich data that you presented. It's just very, very amazing stuff. So thank you guys both for working through it, and thank you those who are here to attend and benefit from this talk and new insights. And by the way, Tushar is a strict vegan, so you can imagine how difficult it is. I have a hard time being vegetarian, born and raised that way. Speaking about meat-based diets, I just cannot sound authentic or, explain myself in any convincing way. So imagine, with his wonderful education and all his experiences in environmentalism, for him to have pulled together a talk like this, it's amazing. So thank you.
You're
Sorry,
welcome.
I'm preempting Mike and a few others here, but I just want to let you know I appreciate what you did.
If I don't want to take too much more of your time at all, but I would love to ask you, can you give us some marching orders, Dr. Mehta, because all of us are so concerned about the planet. We want to get the message that you just gave us out to the world and to policymakers, to COP26, to whatever. What can we do in addition to changing our own diets, which we are or have? What can we do? What would you say would be the best thing?
I think a starting point is to learn the information correctly so that when we're talking about plant-based foods, we're saying the right thing. Because there are people who say things about plant-based foods that are exaggerations or not true. We don't want to be there. We don't need to do that. But we want to give a true and accurate representation of how important this is, and do it in a healthy way. Learn about the nutrition, learn about the environment, learn about zoonotic diseases. And what I love to do is I love to educate educators, because it's through systemic change that we're going to make a difference. And me giving a lecture to 10 people or 100 people or 1,000 people isn't going to make a difference. It's when we continue to educate other people that it really makes a difference. And I hope that everybody will do it in the best way that they're good at. Some will be more data people, some will be more organizing conferences, some will be more food activists where you're going to promote like amazing tasty foods and show how good they are. People are going to find their strength in doing it. So please find your strength and work together as a team. Be positive. I love talking to people who are full meat eaters, because it's not about being vegan or not vegan. That's not true. Even if I'm vegan, my food has an impact on the earth, but I still have to try and minimize the packaging, this, that, some of the things I mentioned, right? And so we're all part of a journey of transition. It's not binary. And so even if somebody's having, like Manish Bhai, maybe you're vegetarian, but you're not vegan, that's okay, it doesn't matter. But what matters is the direction that we're going and what we're trying to work towards. Right? So we're doing it with the right intention. We're trying to always learn. We're trying to make steps, real steps, not just baby steps. I hope, because baby steps have failed the planet, but the direction that we're going, and we're working together in this project, so that teamwork. And I have friends who are full on like carnivores, but that's okay. If they can eat more plant-based foods, even if they're not vegetarian or vegan, that's okay. They've made a difference by doing so. Right? And we want to try and be positive about everything that everybody does and do it together. I think that's really important. It's going to be so important. Remember, it's not the only important thing. We also have to degrow our materials economy and the material and land and energy that we use in all kinds of other ways. I encourage people to read a book by called Less is More by Jason Hickel. Great book. I don't think this guy's plant-based. He probably doesn't really get that part just from some of the little things that tipped me off in his book. But this is something that is concurrently important. There's a Bill Rees is another, or William Rees, he's another environmentalist who talks about sort of degrowth of the material economy, sustainable degrowth of the material and energy economy. That is critical. So these are all things, if we really care about the planet and the people on the planet, that are going to be concurrently important, so we want to really emphasize the plant-based stuff in conjunction with the other things too in a scientific way.
Thank you so much.
Can I just ask one question? I know we're like really we've taken up a lot of time. Dr. Mehta, do you have like 5 minutes? Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I mean, I couldn't agree more with you that probably plant-based, eating a plant-based or plant-rich meal, or following a diet like that is one of the solutions. Like, it has to go in hand with other habits and behaviors that we have been following for the past 100 years. But I wonder, what do you do with people? I mean, how do you approach people who completely deny the science or deny the facts about the way animal agriculture, about the degree to which animal agriculture is causing harm to the planet? There are many. I meet a lot of environmentalists who do a lot of stuff. Like, they give talks about solar panels, they talk about renewables, I mean cars, and many other things. But the minute I talk about animal agriculture, that's the time they totally just, they become completely closed. And so how do we manage those people? How do we?
Well, I think you're very right. This is a super difficult topic that goes against the grain of many people's sort of cultures and biases and things that they like. People like meat. People eat meat like meat. I used to, I'm in a vegetarian culture, but I actually grew up eating meat, and I became vegetarian around the age of like 16. Okay, so I know how people like this stuff, because I had it myself, and that's why people like the mock meats too, right? Because people like them. Okay, this is difficult. Social change is difficult. When we talk about, it's not the only talk about the environmental movement is in a mess, I believe, because everybody is shooting off in their own little individual tangents and not looking at things as a whole and not looking at things scientifically. If you want to talk about international development, if you want to talk about the global financial system and talk about how the global financial system is completely not fair to the poor people of the world, right? And that a lot of us rich people have to share a lot more of what we have with the poor people and have less. People don't want to hear that. There'll be a lot of people in the environmental movement who do not want to hear that. They want to hear about how you can take the current economic model and somehow make it green. People do not want to hear about sustainable degrowth of the material economy and energy economy. People do not want to hear about population related issues. There's a lot of people who just don't want to talk about that. They want to say, no, because population is oversimplified and looked upon as something that makes people in developing countries look bad, but it's much more complicated than that. You can be pro-development. I run a family planning program in Haiti. That's one of the things that I do. I'm also on the board of advisors for an organization called Population Balance. So check that out as well. Some really good podcasts on that. Really good populationbalance.org. Okay, check that out. I hope I just stated the website correctly. They don't want to talk about population related issues. They don't want to talk about there's many things that people don't want to talk about. They don't want to talk about living a life without cars. You can't just switch everything over to a Tesla and expect that we're going to be sustainable. It's not going to work. Okay, and people don't want to hear that. So it's not just plant-based diet. There's a lot of things that people don't want to look at logically because they don't want to give up the lifestyle that they have. They don't want to give up flying, right? I fly a lot. That's my biggest environmental sin. Now I haven't because of COVID, but unfortunately, I'm going to have to face the facts, and I can't rationalize this part of my lifestyle, right? I have to minimize it. Even if I don't eliminate it, I have to minimize it. I don't know what I'm going to do. We're going to have to try and find other ways of transporting ourselves. It may take more time and more effort, okay? You got to take a bus, right? Bus is more sustainable than a Tesla any day, People don't want to hear that. Okay, so it's a problem throughout the environmental movement for many different parameters, and we're going to have to keep hitting people with the science and getting better at communicating these things. And there's more gamification of all these things. Tesla is going to promote itself as an environmental. Shell is going to say Shell oil has a big net zero carbon neutral advertisement. It's bogus. There's a lot of greenwashing and misinformation, and people want to hear it because it maintains their the lifestyle that they're currently enjoying, right?
Right.
And so this is a problem that exceeds plant-based diet, really, and we're going to have to do a lot of work.
Thank you.
Are there any final questions or comments from Dr. Mehta?
All right, well, the one I'm going to say is thank you so much to all of our attendees for this meeting. And thank you, of course, to Dr. Mehta. And thank you so much to the Plant-Rich Diet team for helping to keep this going and continue us on our journey. So thank you, everyone, so much.
Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you,
All right.
Dr. Mehta.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Mehta.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very
Great to
much.
meet
Tushar.
you.
It was awesome.
Right.
Thanks for all of your work. Goodbye,
All right.
everyone. Good night.
Wonderful discussion by our entire group, because this is the passionate core group of the Plant-Rich Diet Task Force here. And you know, as you know, there are people scattered all over the world who registered for this thing, but for everybody, the timing is an issue, right? Depending on where they are in the world. So, but this team has made the commitment to stick it out and be there with every speaker.
And hopefully this team will go on to become like really strong educators, you know, and it's going to take a lot of learning for all. I'm always learning every day.
The talks they've given.
You know, yeah. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
So nice to meet you.
Thank you, Mike.
So nice to meet you. And thank you, Mike.